For our reflection this morning, I want to read from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verse 32 through 44. Another part of the narrative of what happens a little bit before Jesus' crucifixion and death. Mark chapter 10, verse 32. It's on page 46 of the New Testament. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. He took the 12 aside again and began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise again." James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life at ransom for many." I wonder if you had a teacher, professor that would say something like this: "You know, of everything I've taught you, this is the most important. You cannot forget." Or, "Of all your 4 years of college or of studies, you can forget everything except this. This is what is going to make the difference in your life." There are always some teachers that may be tempted to say this. You know, this is the key teaching that will make the whole difference in your life. Everything else you may forget. Well, although sometimes I'm tempted to think like this, it's obviously this is a exaggeration. You know, it's a reductionism that is far too off. But when we come to the narrative of the Gospels, I tend to think that this week is the key week of the time of Jesus. In a way, if we do not understand what happens this week, we don't get it. If we don't understand some of the teachings of Jesus that prepared for this week, and some of the things that will happen this week, we don't get it. Today, as you know, is Palm Sunday. Is the day that Jesus entered Jerusalem before his crucifixion. He will be arrested on the Thursday of that week. He will be crucified. He will die, and he will rise again. So 1 week from now, we celebrate that he is risen. But as we come to the Gospels, and as you may see, I went back a little before Jesus entering Jerusalem, which according to Mark will happen in chapter 11. I went back to chapter 10, verse 32, to remember some of the teachings of Jesus and some of the things that Jesus was saying to his disciples to prepare them for these last few days. And when we come to these teachings of Jesus, I come to think that this is actually the most decisive week of Jesus' ministry and, in a way, of our faith. It's also the week in which the disciples are confronted in a very personal way and very direct way with the reality of following Jesus. All four Gospels tell us in different ways, or maybe with different details, about these last few days before Jesus' death and then resurrection. This text in particular that we read, verse 32 through 34, as you may see in our Bibles here, it has the title, A Third Time Jesus Foretells His Death and Resurrection. It's the third time that Jesus is predicting his death, or that he is advising his disciples about his death and his crucifixion. We have seen it before, chapter 8, verse 31. In a different occasion, I've spoke of this text, but 8:31 is his first prediction. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering. This first prediction, or foretelling, was right after Peter confessed and recognized, "You are the Christ." Jesus was asking his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they said, the disciple says, "Well, some say it's John the Baptist, others say is Elijah, and still others, they say it's one of the prophets." And Jesus says, "What about you? Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Christ." What a great confession. It's almost to say that, wow, they finally got it. Now they understood it. And I imagine here, I think here as a teacher, it says, Jesus says, okay, they got that lesson fine, they got it. Well, now we can advance to a more advanced understanding. We can go further. We can go deeper. And he speaks of his suffering. But when Peter hears what Jesus is saying, his reaction is totally different this time. He thinks that Jesus is putting himself down too much. He says, "No, don't think about this. This is not it. You're thinking too lowly of yourself." Um, Basically, this is what Peter says. He says, um, uh, uh, he reacts and Jesus says to Peter, he rebuked Peter, even saying to Peter that he was maybe being influenced by Satan. Well, the point is, when Jesus was actually saying about his death, and the disciples weren't ready for that. Well, the second time this happens um, is in chapter 9. Again, Jesus is advising that he was going to be put to death. And he becomes, giving more details. As a matter of fact, these three predictions about Jesus' suffering is happening in the second part, the second main section of the book of Mark. Since chapter 8, verse 31, or actually a little bit before, 27, 27 says that Jesus, chapter 8, 27, Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and the way he asked his disciples, "Who the people are saying that I am?" And as we see, from this point on, Jesus is going towards Jerusalem, and he is teaching his disciples in a more particular way about the Messiah. Up to this time, the focus of Jesus' ministry was in Galilee, was with the multitudes, the crowds, and many times he had a reserved time with the disciples. But from this point on, it seems like he's getting a little bit more personal with the disciples. Yes, he will still be teaching publicly, but he will be speaking to the disciples in a more personal way, in a more profound way about his messiahship. And as I said, this is a very important week, not only for what happens to Jesus, but also for what happens to the disciples. And I come to think that during this week, a few things happens. And besides what happens to Jesus, two things happens to the disciples. They are confronted with the reality of following Jesus. They need to comprehend who Jesus is. And they need to be committed to following Jesus. What calls my attention is with these three predictions about Jesus' suffering is what comes right after each one of these. Like I said, the first prediction of Jesus' death was when Peter reacted the way he reacted, and just as after this, we have the transfiguration when Jesus takes some of his disciples up to the mountain, and God tells, there's this voice from heaven, God telling them, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." But the second time that Jesus makes a prediction about his suffering, we come to chapter 9, verse 32, and it says that they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask. Seems like they weren't still getting it. The third time, this is where the text that we read, the third time that he predicts his death, He also approached by James and John with a question. The second time, they are asked, the disciples are discussing who is the greatest. The third time, James and John is asking for them to be sitting next to Jesus. It's as if they're starting to get it. They're starting to understand that Jesus will not be here forever. He's talking about death. He's talking about being condemned to death and dying. So we need to have a plan. It's as if they're thinking, if Jesus is gone, who's going to take his place? So their question is, who is the greater among us? And again, when Jesus says this again about his death, James and John are thinking, who's going to be next to Jesus? Who are going to be the more important ones? And as we hear this, the reaction of the disciples and Jesus telling them about their wondering, he says, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. That's when they were wondering who was the greatest. And in the text that we read, he says also that among you is not that like this, but whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. Interestingly, these predictions about Jesus' death is put between two miracles where Jesus opens the sight of a blind person. In chapter 8 in Bethsaida and chapter 10 in Jericho. And as we read back in chapter 8, verse 17 and 19, after Jesus had healed a deaf person, he says, why you're talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Or your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves of 5,000, how many baskets full broken pieces did you collect? They said 12. Jesus is confronting them. They're not getting. They're not understanding. Jesus heals a deaf person. Jesus heals a blind person. And then in Jericho, he heals another blind person. And it's as to say that the greatest problem here are not the blind and the deaf, but the disciples that are walking with him. They have ears and they don't hear. They have eyes and they don't see it. There's something missing about them that they can't get it. So they are confronted by Jesus, by the reality of following Jesus, by Jesus' mission as the Messiah. The Passion Week is actually a time of reflecting the true understanding of who Jesus Christ, the Messiah, who he really is. When I see these pages in the gospel, I see the disciples being repeatedly confronted with the understanding of the Messiah. Only those who really understand who Jesus is can follow him. But this is the second challenge that they are confronted with. They're confronted with the not only with the understanding of who Jesus is, but they're also challenged to follow Jesus. So in a way, this week, this last week of Jesus on earth is, or before his death and resurrection, is also a time of testing who are the closest disciples. Jesus tests his commitment. Again, back in 8:34, he called them and says, um, if anyone want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. You want to follow Jesus? You have to deny yourself. Take the cross and deny yourself and follow Jesus. That, in a sense, is the cost of discipleship. Again, in 9:34, and he says, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. After the third prediction, he says again, whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. The Gospel of John tells us a story that the other Gospels don't tell, is when Jesus was washing the feet of the disciples in his last supper with the disciples. And after he does that, he says, I have set you an example that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their masters, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. Jesus washed the feet of the disciples and says, you see, this is an example. So if I'm the master, I'm doing this. This is how you should also do. Can you see, in all these stories, Jesus is referring to servanthood. Jesus is referring to being willing to serve others, deny oneself, be servant, to serve others. Jesus challenges those who want to follow him. As we have noticed in some of the passages that we read throughout the liturgy, it focuses on Jesus being lowered, especially in the letter of Paul to the Philippians. Jesus being God, he became man and he served others. I'll say that of the many things that we learn of Jesus' passion, these two things to me highlights is that Jesus confronts the disciples as to their understanding of who Jesus was, the Messiah, the true Messiah. And Jesus also challenges those who want to follow and expect from them a commitment. To follow Jesus is more than just to adhere to a nice teaching. It's about denying oneself and to be a servant. At this time, during this Passion Week, we may reflect on the true identity of Christ and to renew our commitment to Christ, to reaffirm and remember our faith in Christ and Christ's suffering and resurrection. May the Lord bless us. Amen.